home means safety, stability. Housing to me is prevention. Housing is healthcare. Housing is recovery. Housing is the foundation of everything good in our lives. If we don't have housing, then we don't have physical or mental well-being. Our children are not able to excel in school. Housing insecurity almost always couples with food insecurity. So home to me is the foundation of all that is good in our lives.
Homes MHARI is a coalition of organizations working to ensure that everyone has a safe, healthy, and affordable home. Hopefully, these interviews will bring insights to the need and work and highlight where housing intersects with other issues and opportunities.
I'm Laurie-Marie Pisciotta, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mental Health Association of Rhode Island.
Yeah, can you tell me a little bit about your organization and the type of work you do?
Sure. The Mental Health Association was founded about 100 years ago by a gentleman named Clifford Beers. Mr. Beers was a mental health consumer and had spent time in various psychiatric institutions and was horrified at the dismal conditions, the abuse, the indignity that patients were facing. And he started a movement to deinstitutionalize people so that they did not have to spend their whole lives in a facility, sometimes literally in a cage or wearing iron shackles, shackled in place for hours at a time. He wrote a memoir called A Mind That Found Itself. And doctors were very impressed and moved by his autobiography, his memoir, and they joined his movement, which gave it a lot of credibility, and thus began the movement to deinstitutionalize people. I am following in Mr. Beers's footsteps. I am a mental health consumer. I have lived experience with mental illness. When I was 17, I recovered from anorexia nervosa. I survived 2 very significant episodes of clinical depression. One I would say was life-threatening. And I live with complex PTSD from childhood stuff. So I approach this work as someone who is also living with sometimes symptoms that come up, working on my own recovery and healing, and also having the experience of having been in residential treatment or trying to get insurance to cover a treatment. So I bring that perspective to my work.
Like what's sort of the day-to-day? Are you like an advocacy organization? Are you providing services?
So we do not provide direct services. We don't offer mental health treatment or support services. Our mission is to promote and nourish mental health through public advocacy, education, research projects, and policy development. I spend a lot of time tracking legislation, testifying in writing or orally on legislation. Our Parity Stakeholders Initiative is a cohesive advocacy group of behavioral health providers, consumers, state stakeholders like the Department of Behavioral Health, Developmental Disabilities and Hospitals, the Attorney General's Office, many other community-based organizations. We all come together and we work collaboratively on policy development and legislation to increase access to mental health treatment in Rhode Island. I also sit on the Office of Health Insurance Commissioner's Health Insurance Advisory Council. I participate in all the meetings of the Governor's Council on Behavioral Health, the Providence Mayor's Council on Behavioral Health as well. So we do research, public education, policy development. We've done a lot of virtual events, providing education, resources, and support throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are sort of I would say the watchdog of the mental health community, making sure that people have access to the treatment they need, and doing our part to be an advocate and a voice at the State House.
Awesome. In your research and your advocacy work, like what are the sort of findings on the intersection of mental health and housing? Like, I often find that like when you come to these intersections, there's often like kind of multiple angles. So like for like maybe health, you would find like there's the effect that health would have on being able to secure housing. And then there's like the effect that like having secure housing or not having secure housing has an effect on your health. Okay, so can you speak a little bit to that sort of like crossroads between mental health and housing?
Sure. Yeah, housing is a very important issue for everyone, but particularly people who have very serious, persistent mental illness. These individuals have complicated conditions that make it difficult, if not impossible, for them to live entirely on their own. And because the state of Rhode Island has not invested in enough supportive housing options to meet their needs, these are individuals who often end up cycling in and out of homelessness, emergency room departments, inpatient hospitals, and prison or jail, because the nature of their disability does not allow them to take care of themselves, to take their medications every day. And so I feel like this is the most vulnerable population that the Mental Health Association represents in Rhode Island. This is, the far end of the spectrum. Mental wellness is a spectrum with perfect health on one end of the spectrum, and then very serious and persistent mental illness on the other end. And these are folks who are falling to that other end. And they are vulnerable, and they need people like the Mental Health Association and other advocates in the state to look out for them, because they can't look out for themselves. They can't speak for themselves. So that's what we do. But as I mentioned earlier, I believe housing is the foundation of everything. So aside from people who have very serious persistent mental illness, housing is recovery for the person who is doing pretty well, but perhaps is struggling with recovery from a substance use disorder, or living with clinical depression, or a mood disorder like bipolar disorder. Without housing, those individuals would certainly go downhill very fast, because housing is the foundation of everything. You're not going to take your medication every day if you're living out of your car or on the streets or in a homeless shelter. You're not going to eat every day. You're not going to sleep well. You're not going to be able to hold down a job very easily if you're living out of your car or in a homeless shelter or in a tent on a street in Rhode Island. So to me, there is no health without housing. There's no recovery without housing. There's no wellness without housing. And the fact that we live in the richest nation in the world, and we still allow people to fall through the cracks, that we still allow people to live in tents on our cold winter streets, is mind-boggling. Where are our priorities as a country, as a society? How does this happen?
Like when you're out there advocating, when you're in these meetings, like what's the thing you're really like pushing for? What do you see as like the best opportunity?
Well, for the state of Rhode Island, one thing that would help would be to establish what is called an Olmstead Plan. Olmstead refers back to a 1999 United States Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court ruled that states have a legal obligation to ensure that individuals with disabilities, disabilities like serious persistent mental illness, intellectual developmental disabilities, or physical disabilities, that the state has a legal obligation to ensure that they have their basic needs met so that they don't fall into institutionalization unnecessarily, that they have options, that they can live in the community among friends and family members if they want to. And one way that a state demonstrates its intention to comply with this legal obligation is to form what is often called an Olmstead Plan. Some states call it something else, but many states just call it an Olmstead Plan. Rhode Island is one of 6 or 7 states in the country that does not have any type of a plan. And because we don't have a plan, our failure to plan leaves vulnerable individuals with disabilities, including serious and persistent mental illness. It leaves these vulnerable individuals to fend for themselves. If we had an Olmstead Plan, it would accomplish a few things. Number one, the first step of an Olmstead Plan is to conduct a statewide needs assessment, to look at what do we have? In other words, our supply of resources, including affordable housing, supportive housing, congregate care setting, recovery housing. So what's the supply? And then look at also what is the need? What is the unmet need? What is the demand for these resources? So once it does this statewide needs assessment, then it begins to formulate a plan. If we need X number of beds in a psychiatric nursing home, or if we need X number of affordable housing vouchers, how are we going to get that? How are we going to put permanent funding streams in place in order to achieve those goals? And what's a reasonable timeline in which to achieve those goals? So it would make the plan. And then in the final years of the Olmstead Plan is when you carry out and actually put the funding streams in place and establish or develop these unmet needs for housing, for community support services, for educational supports and employment supports for people with disabilities. So Rhode Island, as I said, is one of a handful of states that doesn't have any type of a plan. And because of that, we're not gaining ground. We're not meeting the unmet needs. We're sort of directionless. And we've made some strides in certain areas, for example, for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, because the state was sued. And part of the consent agreement is that the state now has to invest more than it was previously, so that people with intellectual developmental disabilities are not unnecessarily segregated from the general population because of their disabilities. So we've made some ground in that area, but we're still lacking in the arena of individuals with serious and persistent mental illness. So that's something that Mental Health Association is focusing on for 2021. We've written a policy proposal that will be sent to the governor's office. Very happy for Governor Raimondo to be offered this wonderful position with the Biden administration, but it definitely threw a monkey wrench into our plans to submit a policy proposal to hers. So we've sort of hit pause on where that proposal will go at this point. But that is one thing that we feel very strongly about. You know, it's just mind-boggling, because if you're a small business owner, what do you do before you start the business? You write a plan, right? You look at what your business needs, you look at what you have, and you look at your, the gaps in what you need to get in order to fulfill a successful business model. Yeah. But you have a plan when you start a new business. Rhode Island doesn't have a plan for people with disabilities, and it's sad, and the consequences are very real to people with disabilities.
Or do you already have a draft of like a plan that you're working with, that you're trying to get them to sign on to, or is the plan supposed to be created by like the community? Is that the sort of vision?
Correct. So what I'm working on is a policy proposal to establish an Olmsted plan. It's not actually an Olmsted plan, but it does give a lot of information about what would go into that Olmsted plan. And so we are in the process of collecting signatures for organizations that want to sign on to our policy proposal. There'll be a cover letter accompanying the proposal, and that cover letter will list all the organizations that would ask the governor for an Olmsted plan for people with disabilities. I will say that affordable housing is an issue that is very important for people with disabilities, and an Olmsted plan would include affordable housing vouchers or scattered site housing in the community, because people with disabilities often live on SSI or SSDI benefits every month, which are quite limited. And you can imagine how difficult it must be to find affordable housing in Rhode Island with that sort of a very limited income. So it is important that we have enough affordable housing stock in Rhode Island for people with disabilities.
Definitely. And there's a lot of discrimination out there against people with sources of income that are atypical.
Yes, the Mental Health Association will testify again to support legislation that would prohibit landlords from being allowed to discriminate against, for example, Section 8 vouchers. You know, I'm apartment hunting myself, and I was just amazed at how brazen some landlords are that they will say, you know, no Section 8 in an advertisement on Craigslist. That's makes it so tough for people. I was a case manager for AIDS Action in Massachusetts, and we had laws in Massachusetts that did not allow landlords to discriminate against income source. Because if they did, I would have never been able to find housing for my clients. Never. Because, you know, almost all of my case management clients had some type of voucher that they were getting for their disabilities. Yeah. So yeah, it just makes it so tough for people to find housing when landlords can discriminate like that.
Yeah. So it's already illegal. Like they're legally obligated to do it, but they're just not doing it. Do I have that right?
So they're not under a legal obligation to create a plan, but the Supreme Court ruling said that you can demonstrate your intention to comply with the law by having a plan in place that you can point to. Mm-hmm. And so almost all the other states in our union have a plan except for 6 or 7. We're in the company of Florida, I think, and Florida, Tennessee, Idaho, New Mexico, South Dakota, and Washington, D.C. Those are the states that don't have any type of a plan for individuals with disabilities.
Interesting. So why the approach of advocacy and not lawyering, or not just like, is it a funding problem that you can't just raise the money to sue the state to get the ball rolling? Or
that's a great question, Trey. We don't have an attorney, and we're not in the business of suing the state, like, for example, an ACLU.
Yeah.
Although I have heard some rumblings about people starting to question if they need to sue the state. But there are disadvantages to that. Number one, when the United States Department of Justice steps in, because it's the United States Department of Justice that would sort of design the plan of correction for the state.
Yeah.
So that's a disadvantage because Rhode Islanders know what we need better than the U.S. Department of Justice. And we losing control over our plan if the U.S. Department of Justice were to step in and take over things. Number two, whenever the state is sued, it costs the state money. They have to pay penalty fees and such. And that is money that could be spent on important resources like housing.
Yeah.
So that's another disadvantage.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, are you, are these the Olmstead Plan is normally enacted by the executive branch of the state in the other instances, the other 40 whatever instances of homestead plans, or is there sometimes a legislative component where they're like, the state now, the governor now has to do this or whatever? Why approach it through the governor as opposed to as a bill or something?
My thinking in having the governor have an opportunity to review the policy proposal and see for herself or perhaps himself, depending on the timing, is that they would really support it and want to, take it for their own and really make something of it through an executive order, which is a lot easier than getting legislation passed. Other states have passed legislation, and some states do it on their own, and still other states are sued and then form an Olmstead Plan as a result of that lawsuit because the Department of Justice requires them to. Some states will have an Olmstead office as part of one of their state departments and agencies, and others might just have like a volunteer council with the head of each state department or agency and lots of community-based organizations, the boots on the ground, meeting together on a regular basis to determine what are unmet needs and how to achieve those unmet needs. So there are different ways of doing it. There's no cookie cutter approach that we have to follow. But my thinking was that I think that any governor would have an interest in ensuring that people with disabilities are given all of the resources and supports necessary to live the full and rich lives that you and I and he or she, enjoy every day and take for granted.
We want our representatives to be deliberate about what they're doing and to take it on as like something they believe in, as opposed to us having to force them to do it. Yeah. So if somebody's watching this and they're like, oh, this is really interesting, I want to learn more and I want to get involved in supporting the Homestead Act and the work that your organization is doing in general, like what would be your like call to action? Like, is there like one sort of specific thing that somebody could do to get involved, or is there like a suite of things?
To get involved with our efforts, we have a web page on our website called Integration for All. And there's a place where people can sign up to receive action alerts when there's a call to action to, for example, make a call to the governor's office or another elected official. That's a great way to get involved. Consumer participation, civic participation in our democracy is really important. Elected officials need to hear from the people they represent, and they need to hear what's important to their constituents in order to make decisions based on that. And I think that citizens are much more powerful than we think, that we really can influence our elected officials. And even if we're up against, a powerful corporation like a pharmaceutical company or a health insurance company, it makes a difference, I think, when lots of constituents get involved and let their elected officials know what's important to them and what's needed. So I encourage people to sign up for our action alerts and keep in contact with your own elected officials. You can go to the General Assembly's website and you can find out who your senator and representative are, and keep in contact with them.
And what's your web address?
Oh, so www.mhari.org. And you can go to our homepage right now. There's a slider on our homepage that talks about an Olmstead Plan. And if you click on the Learn More button, it will take you to the Integration for All webpage where you can sign up for action alerts.